Have you ever thought about how your name would be remembered when you're gone? A lot of people have at least casually wondered about such a question. And then there's this other thought: what if we'd have lived in the past and our name was written in the Bible as a kind of a lesson for others, which could be kind of awkward or could be kind of pleasant, as a reminder for other people? Well, we always hope that that would be a positive lesson. Well, today I want to cover Philippians 4, verses 1 through 9. But the letter to the Philippians, the Apostle Paul refers to two women by name. Now, it's only in one place in the Bible, Euodia and Syntyche. And there was an apparent unresolved conflict between these two ladies. And Paul's letter then, as we read in Philippians, and particularly as he mentions in Philippians 4, verses 1 through 9, it becomes a reminder to the church, and by extension it means to us, about the importance of unity. So the title of today's Bible study is Euodia and Syntyche, being of the same mind. Euodia and Syntyche, being of the same mind. So we're going to review those few verses, but before we do that, we're going to take a look at the founding of the first Christian congregation in Philippi. Now, Philippi is a city in Macedonia. Today we would probably refer to that as Greece. And Paul was tasked to take the gospel to that part of the world. And if we take a look, this particular area, Paul's second missionary journey left Asia and directed him, meaning what we now think of as Asia Minor or Turkey, and directed him to the Roman colony of Philippi in Macedonia. Now, Philippi, the city, was an important hub of commerce and a leading city in the district. And the women of Philippi were heavily involved in the city's business and trade and had a higher status, it seems, than a lot of women that were in the region. So if we take a look in Acts 16, we can read about Paul's interactions with the women in Philippi. And so if we take a look that when Paul and Silas and Timothy arrived in Philippi, they traveled outside the city gate to find a place for prayer, and they found a group of women gathered by the river, and they decided to stop and talk to them. Now, it's interesting that there was a group of women, and of course one of those women was Lydia. If we read about that in Acts 14, we'll take a quick look there. She was a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira, which is across the sea there. And if we could take a look, then in Acts 14, 11 verses 11 through 15, we read about how Paul baptized the entire household of Lydia, and how that was really a foundation of the congregation there at that time. And in fact, she said, if you've judged me, Lydia told Paul and his party, if you judge me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. So she was from apparently prosperous, had a house big enough to house a number of guests. So the church at Philippi was early established. Now, and I'd heard from a former pastor's, deceased pastor's wife here. They're both deceased. And she said, well, the reason the women were at the river is because it took 10 men to form a synagogue. And they couldn't form the synagogue, so the women were meeting by themselves unofficially, which I found interesting. If we take a look, then as we read in Philippians 4 and starting in verse 1, Paul is writing a letter to this congregation. And this congregation, he says, therefore, my beloved and longed for brethren, my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord, beloved. This is a greeting, and he's approaching them. And in this letter now to the congregation in Philippi, he says, I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Well, so he's naming these two gals that said, we want you to be in the same mind. Notice he also says in the Lord. Now, the name Euodia literally in Greek means fragrant, which is a lot nicer than stinky or a smell. No, it's fragrant. It's a pleasant odor. And then Syntyche literally means fortunate. So those seem to be pretty positive names. Now, we just heard Mr. Shaby's sermon, and he quoted from Revelation 17:13 about the 10 kings who are of one mind, and they gave their power over to the beast. Well, this verse says that these two women should be of the same mind, but then it goes on to say, in the Lord. It's not just that you agree, you have to agree on the right things, okay, the right godly things. So verse 3, Paul writes, I urge you also, a true companion, help these women who labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. So he's saying, not just these two ladies, but others, let's go together with them. Now, I find it interesting, of course, these names are not common. How many people do you hear Euodia or Syntyche today? Not too many. In fact, as the baby boomer generation moves along, pretty soon we won't have names like Linda, Mary, and Kathy anymore either, as it moves through time. But for now, the baby boomers are with us. I married one. So those names may not be common, but they're memorable. But they're only one place in the Bible. So Paul gives his instructions. He says, we've got an issue here, and I want you to resolve the issue between the two of you. In other words, to think the same thing as Christians. So here's the instructions now in verse 3. I urge you also, verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say rejoice. Whoa, in other words, focus on what's important. What's important is the truth, to rejoice in the eternal. Rejoice. And it says, again, I will say rejoice. He's repeating it for emphasis. Verse 5, let your gentleness be known to all men. The Lord is at hand. Well, that's a pretty important factor. First of all, rejoice in the truth, and then be gentle. Now, if people are in conflict, do you normally think of them as being gentle? Oh, I horribly disagree with you, so let's just gently work this out. Or do voices raise up and people get excited, the tone gets pretty harsh, and things can melt down in a hurry. So tone is important, volume is important, but he says gentleness be known, not just to each other, but to everybody. This should be a standard or a pattern. So using gentleness, which is really a good message for all of us to do all the time, is to be as gentle as we can. Then this leads to verse 6. It says, be anxious for nothing. Whoa, that means I better take a look at the things that I'm anxious about. And maybe I shouldn't be anxious at those things. But he's telling them, you don't need to ramp up the anxiety. Now, if somebody is screaming and hollering at you, do you suppose you'd be a little anxious? Maybe a conflict would arise that you would want to, that you don't want. There's a disagreement. Could be an inside or outside the church disagreement. But it says there's no need to be anxious. But then what does it say? But in everything by prayer and supplication. So that'll help resolve the anxieties to bring them down. And then it says this prayer and supplication, it adds with thanksgiving. You know, the most unhappy people in the world are those that aren't thankful. They just don't appreciate what they have. So Paul lists this right here with thanksgiving. And then does he say, grump about it by yourselves? No, he says, let your requests be made known to God. If you have a need and you never share that need, never explain that need, how can anyone help you? That lesson was brought home to me by one of my brothers about 30 years ago. And I said, oh man, this is a hard one. I'll just have to tough it out. And he said, if you don't make your needs known, how will anybody be able to help out? Oh, well, maybe he has a point that others may have. Don't deny others the opportunity to help out. It's true also when you're asking God. Or we don't want to be so unthankful that we don't expect God to produce anything, therefore we can't thank him for it. But if our expectations are that God can provide, then our request can be made known to God with thanksgiving. And then what happens? We read in verse 7, the peace of God which passes all understanding will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. These are prerequisite things. So to rejoice, be gentle, without anxiety, approach the issue with prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Let it be known to God. So share that concerns with your Heavenly Father. And then it gives us, starting in verse 8, finally, brethren, it gives us a list of things. Whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, and if there's anything praiseworthy, just forget about it. Don't worry. Not a problem. It's somebody else's issue, or does it say something else? It says meditate on these things. The things which you have learned and received and heard in me, then, these do. So, first of all, he lists them. Then he says meditate on these things. And then something that's hard for all of us to actually do them. And then there's a result. What is the result? The God of peace will be with you. So here's Paul saying, you guys are true companions. You were companions to me. You were helpful to me. You're helpful for the church. You're helpful to each other. He recognized their conversion to the truth. He lists them as being in the book of life. He had every expectation. And so he said, in order to resolve this, what do we do? First, rejoice. Rejoice about, of course, the implication is rejoice about the truth. Then, be gentle. Let our reputation be gentle. Then, there's no need to have worry or be anxious. When he says be anxious for nothing. But to do that, you have to replace the anxieties with prayer and then ask God to supply your needs. And then he says, when we talk to God, be enormously thankful for what we have. Expressing gratitude is absolutely essential. How often do you hear that nowadays? Walking down the street, going to a store, anybody who provides a service for you. How many people express gratitude to each other, whether it's in the family, whether it's in business, in our personal or social life? But if we don't practice it there, it's often difficult for people to practice the gratitude before God. And then Paul says, do these things. And I put a capital D-O on my notes because it's nice to have nice thoughts. It's nice to think about being gentle. It's nice to say all of these are good things, but what if you don't actually do them? Well, then you don't get the results. But if you do those things, he says, then you can get the results. And what's the result? It's peace. God will grant that peace and help for us. Now, what are the things we're to meditate on? There's, if we're looking to buy a car, say a yellow car, then our subconscious mind will recognize every yellow car that's coming down the road. Now, whenever I purchased a car, I start to recognize everybody else that has that same model of car. It just plumbs into our thinking. And so what does Paul say if we're going to meditate? What does he say to meditate on? things that are true, things that are noble, things that are just, things that are pure, things that are lovely, of a good report, meaning not a bad report, things of virtue, things that are praiseworthy. It says meditate, spend your mind or your focus on them. So if we look for faults and troubles in other people, then our subconscious mind or even our conscious mind will trigger us to see the bad in other people, which is particularly rough if the other people are looking at us. Well, and then that view can whip up into a whirlwind, and that's going to add to our anxieties, and that'll help us to purge the anxieties by meditating on the positive things. But conversely then, if we look at the good in other people, just as the Apostle Paul noted the positive characteristics of Euodia and Syntyche, and then as we practice Paul's teachings, then we're more inclined to be at peace with other people and with ourselves. And then this mindset requires us to take action, then as outlined by the Apostle Paul. Well, I have in my notes here, in the King James, if you're using that, it says Euodias, which is the masculine, but the original is actually the feminine. So in other translations, you'll see the word of the lady Euodia. So just saying, you'll see some conflict in translations, but in fact, the original Greek shows that they're both ladies. If we take a look at Philippians 1 in verse 27, in Philippians 1:27, Paul encapsulates the behavior on how to prevent the dark side problems, prevent the conflicts. He says, Philippians 1:27, only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in one spirit with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. So here they are. He's saying, I want you to be united, whether I am there or whether I am far away. And clearly he heard about Euodia and Syntyche when he was away, and then he couldn't be there right away, so he wrote a letter. And he said, we want to work together, to striving together for the faith of the gospel. So today's message is really about Philippians 4, verses 1 through 9. And it's really about the example that these two ladies, now we don't have the resolution of how they managed to resolve it, but we presume that they were converted. That was Paul's expectation, and that they would practice what he said. And when they practiced what he said, then you'll have peace. And when you have peace, then you'll have unity, of course. And so I want us now, our task today is to remember Philippians 4, verses 1 through 9, Euodia and Syntyche being of the same mind. Let's remember Philippians 4, that example, for the rest of our lives.